make it an exclusion on your criteria to select vendors. Then you would have the leverage to really select the vendors that are cyber secure.
Welcome everyone to the Industrial Security Podcast. I'm Nate Nelson here with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. He's going to introduce the subject and guest of our show today. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Pedro Fernandes, Senior Manager of the European OT Security Practice at Accenture. And he's going to be talking to us about the supply chain. He's going to be talking to us about really committing to managing cyber risk in the supply chain.
All right, then without further ado, here's your interview with Pedro.
Hello, Pedro, and welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about the good work that you're doing at Accenture?
Hi, Andrew. Sure. So as you just said, my name is Pedro Fernandes. I'm based in Portugal, even though I always had an international job, whether within Europe or the Middle East or even America. But my experience with OT security goes back to 2010. When I was working for Cisco, and now at that time I was just loving the smart grid security hype that we had at the moment. So it was not called OT security, but it was really putting together all the electrical and the good old school electrical world together with the new cybersecurity features, together with the environment protection and renewables introduction into the grid. So it was just making a very good click to me, and I started to completely dedicate myself to it. So I quit Cisco. I went to an exclusively dedicated OT security company called World Tech Security Technologies, where I did many assessments for the main oil and gas terminals and upstream and downstream plants, where, especially in the Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, etc. I co-authored a book on smart grid security. Then I went into becoming an expert member of the TC65 Work Group 10, which is the one authoring the 62443 standard. And in the last years, I kind of moved from the oil and gas world to the renewables and utilities world, where I do sales and solutioning for critical infrastructures, and basically talking to CISOs to reorganize the company to be more OT secure. So that's what I do at Accenture, and that's what I love to do.
And our topic today is, the supply chain, risks in the supply chain and what to do about them. The supply chain is a big animal. Can you give us sort of your perspective of the elephant? What is the supply chain to you? What are we talking about today?
So the supply chain can be seen from many angles, as you were saying. Typically, people think of the value chain of products going into systems, going into solutions, then being operated and being decommissioned as a very linear and kind of simple value chain of physical products. But to be honest, that is a very limited view of the supply chain. If we consider a utility that has a big mesh of business relationships and business partners, from outsourced maintenance services, outsourced analytics services, cloud services, outsourced telecommunications infrastructures, physical security, etc. And more we're going into predictive maintenance and other kind of value-add services that they all connect to your crown jewels. You now have a much wider elephant to tackle and a lot more entry vectors to attack, and a lot more vulnerabilities to exploit. So definitely the attackers today are taking advantage of all these physical, logical connections to have a low effort but very, very high impact into your operations.
That all seems, sort of on the abstract side. I mean, I'm looking at the miter kill chain, the attack chain. I don't see supply chain in there. Can you give me some examples of the kind of attacks that we're looking at?
Sure. So if you look closer to what we normally call the ICS kill chain, it's just a series of steps that typically an attacker would have to perform to reach your operational crown jewels, right? And to have physical impact in your operations. If you see, there's two steps that are very critical for the supply chain attacks. One is the delivery step, where the malware or backdoors is delivered not directly to you, but to one of your providers. And the other step is the exploitation step, where you actually exploit vulnerabilities. So, as I was saying before, you can have supply chain attacks based on the threat side, so delivering malware, or based on the vulnerability side, where your providers are giving you and providing you with vulnerabilities, with whether they're 0 days or known vulnerabilities. And to be successful at the delivery step in the ICS kill chain, we need, attackers are taking advantage of introducing malware into very known and trusted products. And the most common and one of the most recent ones is the SolarWinds attacks, where most of utilities use them for to check the health of their networks and the health of their servers. And suddenly it comes with a backdoor and with malicious software in it. So definitely the delivery piece of the kill chain was performed by a supply chain attack. On the other side, we have many exploitations of 0 days vulnerabilities. Configures, Stuxnet are just examples of that. So the vendors were not even aware, but their poor software development practices infiltrated vulnerabilities into their customers, and those were directly exploited by attackers. So definitely that's where the attackers would exploit supply chain. On the MITRE side, for example, MITRE basically tackles the threat side of the house. So they do have a couple of entry vectors and tactics and techniques that are related to the supply chain. For example, so they have one that is called supply chain compromise, for example, where SolarWinds would fit. They have another one that it's called removable media replication, where the Stuxnet would fit. They have another one, the external remote services technique, where the Black Energy, which targeted Ukraine in 2015 and 2016, and the Sandworm team exploited, and they exploited actually the business relationship that the utility had with a much smaller and less secure firm. In this case was an accounting firm that was not very secure, but did have direct connections to the victim. So both the kill chain and the MITRE attack, they do take into account the supply chain, and there are many examples that we could talk about this. So definitely a reality, unfortunately, that it's been exploited.
It occurs to me, though, that we've spoken with at least one, possibly two, specifically cloud security experts in the industrial field who were giving us the pitch to the security benefits of it, that, for example, you have more visibility, more global visibility, such that you could see what's happening in one plant somewhere and then maybe know that it might spread elsewhere and take action in a way that one plant might not be able to get the same information out at the same speed. Overall, are you convinced of those arguments, or do you think that this is a net negative?
Well, you're right there. And, the discussions I recall, a lot of it had to do, this is the Industrial Security Podcast. It had a lot to do about outsourced security, outsourced, like security operations centers, outsourced SEM and SOAR implementations. And when you ask about sort of the security of that, there's a bunch of factors. One is you would expect a SOC, an outsourced SOC vendor, to have put serious security in place to, make it very difficult to pivot attacks through their SOC. This is the whole point. But sort of bigger picture is when we look at, how safe is it to use a particular cloud service, we have to look at the entire system. And, there may be compensating measures on the source side. If you are sending data out to a cloud-based system from an isolated network that does nothing but gather data, if the consequences of compromising those sensors is a business consequence as opposed to a physical consequence, you've got to look at the system. There may be unidirectional gateways between your control system that has sensors in it and going out to a cloud system, or back to the outsourced SOC. Sending, syslog and other intrusion detection alerts, out through a firewall, out to an encrypted network, all the way out to the cloud-based SOC. That's a whole different animal than having your devices on the control network that are capable of firmware updates, connect out to the cloud and ask, do you have a firmware update for me? So, the long answer is it depends. Well, that's actually a short answer, but it does depend, and there are circumstances that are more and less dangerous than others. But a big selling point in a lot of sort of industrial cloud applications is automatic or remote controlled firmware updates, and that's the really dangerous bit in my mind. And you mentioned IEC 62443 a few minutes ago. Is there a 62443 standard for supply chain security? How does 62443 work with supply chain threats?
Yes, so 62443 is an interesting standard regarding the supply chain. Basically, when it talks about supply chain, it has in mind the value chain of the IX, right? So from components into products, into systems, into solutions, into operations, and finally into the decommissioning. So the life cycle of the IX. Not necessarily the full mesh of business relationships in itself, or at least explicitly tagged with supply chain security. So when the 62443 addresses supply chain, it's in the IX lifecycle. However, if you look closer at the 62443, it's a role-based standard. So you have requirements for product manufacturers and for system integrators and for service suppliers and for service owners, for asset owners. And there's even a paper on the 62443 applied to IoT and the cloud and edge computing. So the fact that it's really adapted with different requirements to different roles, it makes it very easy for any company that it operates as one of these roles to look at their supply chain and say, well, if my supply chain is these many roles, then they have to comply with these many standards. And if I am in this role, then I have to comply with these requirements, because I am a link in the supply chain. I have customers, and my customers are looking upwards to their supply chain, and I'm part of that. So the fact that the 62443 breaks it down by role is very interesting for the supply chain. Now, to build what we call the supply chain risk management program, it's not only about going to the 62443 requirements on supply chain security. We have to go to all the requirements that talk about remote access, that talk about physical security, that talk about HR security because of the outsourcing, that talk about contract language. And only by putting together all the explicitly tagged supply chain security requirements with the other requirements, we can build our risk management program.
Can you give us an example how that would work? I mean, you talked about the 62443 standard being role based. Let's say I was we're building a substation, and we've got one of the big vendors coming in. They're putting the transformers in place. They're putting in all of the computers, all of the automation. How would 62443 apply to that sort of role in that process?
Yes, good question. There's just with those two sentences that you said about the substation, we have a lot of roles already there. So normally these big constructions, they start with an EPC company, right? With an engineering, procurement, and construction company. That EPC company typically has very, very poor security practices. They typically sub-hire then a big industrial vendor to put in the transformers, the control systems, the cabinets, the control rooms, the data centers, all the instrumentation, all the inputs and outputs, etc., etc. So we have, just from this scenario, we're having product suppliers, so the ICS vendors. We have system integrators, which would probably be the same ICS vendor together with some other companies, networking companies, security companies, to put together a system. Then they go on site and they deploy the system, and that becomes the solution. Once it's configured for the company, it becomes a control system solution for that company. Then we start operating that and we start maintaining. And many times the maintenance is also done by the same big ICS vendor. So we already have many roles here that have very distinct and differentiated security requirements within the 62443, and therefore supply chain requirements. So the customer is looking at the maintenance service provider to comply with a certain requirements, and it's looking at the system integrator to comply with another set of requirements, and is looking at the product manufacturer to comply with another set of requirements as part of their of its supply chain. Now, all these roles may be done by a single company, and that single company is normally these big ICS vendors. So they have a big responsibility in supply chain. That's one thing. But the other thing is that they have to know they have supply chain below them, and they have supply chain above them, so upwards and downwards. They have to go into their component manufacturers, the memories, the CPUs, the servers, the desktops providers, and make sure it's cyber secure from their end. But then they have to make sure that when they deliver their solution to the customer, the delivery itself is secure from the shipping perspective, the software integrity perspective, etc., etc. So what I was saying before is, once you know your role within the 62443 or several roles, you not only comply with those as you ask your upward vendors to comply with theirs. And not only you have to look for supply chain tagged security controls, but also from all these other business relationships, security controls like the remote access, the legal, etc., etc., etc. So in the end, it becomes a security program that it's not easy, but definitely very important to perform.
Okay, so there's a lot of roles, there's a lot of requirements. I mean, my experience of, my personal experience of supply chain security, I work at Waterfall. We supply end users. We supply vendors who in turn supply end users. My experience of this is that a couple of years ago, we started getting questionnaires, and these questionnaires are getting longer and longer. And, the questionnaires, they have stuff in there that seems relevant, like, what do you do to make sure that bad guys can't get into your source code and insert nasties on us? That kind of makes sense. We get other questions, though. How do your cloud services protect customer data? We don't have any cloud services that have access to customer data. How do your people, how do you control how do you assure that you've got trustworthy people managing your cloud services, those cloud services that have access to customer data? We don't have any of those people because we don't have any cloud services that manage customer data. These questionnaires, they're 60 and 70 questions long, and they seem to be sort of boilerplate. They seem to be one size fits all. It's the same questionnaire that you send to, the service provider who's setting up your email system. It's the same questionnaire that you use for, your vendor who's putting PLCs into your substations. Does this make any sense?
Yes, sure it does not. So questionnaires are typically used for more of a compliance-oriented assessment, right? Checkboxes and audits, not really to assess the risk that a third party is adding to to the operations of a critical infrastructure. And what we want here is to build a risk management program that assesses and controls and reduces the risk from the supply chain. And I mean, in the end of the day, you can use questionnaires just to guide the conversation with your suppliers, but not as a checkbox, as you were mentioning, but simply as a guided dialogue. And definitely the questionnaires or the tools that you use should be tailored for the company that you're assessing. I would say, for example, that security companies that have their security solutions and security products that may go into your control systems and safety systems they have to be very well assessed, because these solutions, they have connectivity with almost everything, right? These solutions, they try to provide asset visibility, traffic visibility, vulnerability management, threat hunting, network segmentation, etc., etc. And therefore, if someone gains access and manages to compromise such a product, it has IP connectivity to most of your control systems and maybe even the safety systems. So definitely there's a big focus on security solutions to be very well developed with as less vulnerabilities as possible, and definitely a very robust and a development environment to make sure no malware goes into it. Once malware goes into monitoring and security solutions, then it's almost game over, like it was for the SolarWinds attacks, right? So move away from audit-like tools, go into the risk assessment, but with a very big focus on security solutions. It would be my recommendation here.
Cyber attacks with physical consequences more than doubled in 2021. For industrial victims, the most common consequences were production outages at multiple sites. Most of the attacks were ransomware. And 2021 saw the first cloud-based ransomware attack. That attack compromised 1,500 businesses in the space of 45 minutes. These and other insights are included in a new threat report, co-authored by Waterfall Security Solutions and the new ICS Strive Industrial Incident Repository. For your copy of the report, please visit icsstrive.com. That's ICSSTRIVE.com.
So, Nate, I mean, I take Pedro's point that questionnaires are about compliance. And we do need to focus on risk. We need to focus on risks in the supply chain, to our business and to our customers. But compliance matters too. I mean, if you're governed by NERC-CIP, you have to comply with NERC-CIP or you suffer fines. And so, I'm thinking questionnaires are a fact of life. Yes, you need to do risk, but you also need to do compliance. And I mean, one of the things that really bugs me about these questionnaires is context. So many, you get 70 questions and there's no context on any of them. What measures do you take to ensure that your employees who have access to sensitive data are trustworthy? Well, which data are we talking about? Because we take different measures with different groups of employees. Are we talking access to Waterfall sensitive data, like, Waterfall's employees? Are we talking about access to our product source code? Are we talking about, access to customer network designs? Because that's covered under NERC-CIP confidential information. Are we talking about, if it's a power utility, data about their customers, personally identifiable data about their customers? So, you just don't know. The question doesn't say. You got to pick up the phone, you call the utility, and they say, all we care about is your people who have access to our customers' personally identifiable data that we gave you. You're not giving us any of that. Okay, next. A little bit of context would really help folks. Okay, so making the questionnaires sort of a little more specific to the role the vendor plays, and presumably if a vendor is playing multiple roles, they would get multiple questionnaires from the same customer. I mean, that makes some sense. What other? I mean, you do this for a living. What other tips have you got for people in terms of doing supply chain security the right way?
Yes. So, there's a couple of problems that are not only supply chain security problems, but they affect the whole security industry, the OT security industry, in every single customer that I visit. One of them is, of course, lack of the specialized workforce, right? So you may have your vendors provide you with all the evidences of low vulnerabilities and all the SBOMs and VEXs and all the other technology and documentation around supply chain security. But if you don't have your in-house specialized workforce, then you will not be able to even cope or monitor or follow up with your vendors' assurance of security, right? So there's a general lack of specialized workforce. Then in smaller countries, you even have the problem of the big vendors not having that expertise in the country. I mean, they have the expertise in the headquarters and in the big countries, but not in smaller countries. So in the end, it's useless whatever product security, supply chain security technique comes from the vendor, so the solution is more and more to automate, and to make it to join forces with other similar companies. So if you're a utility in a country, why do it alone if your problems are, if you're a distribution, the transmission utility would have the same problems. The generation utility would have the same problems. And your neighboring countries have the same problem. So why don't we go sectorial or regional in our efforts? Since the problems are the same, and even the vendors are the same for all the countries. So one of the tips and the advices that I would have for asset owners is to get into dialogue with their peers in other countries in the same country, and to join forces and to exchange information and to collaborate. In the end, they may even share the same vendors. So that's one. The other thing is that we are in a point of time where cyber supply chain security is a very hot topic. There's a lot of technologies, techniques, methods to assess your supply chain. There are specialized companies only to assess the cybersecurity of the supply chain. There are scorecards, templates, tools, methodologies, frameworks that you can use. So you're not alone. The problem is big. Collaborate, join forces with other peers, and make use of automation tools and solutions out there. But the whole thing only really works if you have a negotiating leverage, right? If you, in your contracts, when you're acquiring a new control system, make cybersecurity rating, a certain cybersecurity rating, make it an exclusion on your criteria to select vendors. Then you would have the leverage to really select the vendors that are cyber secure, and try pushing the whole market into be more secure at the systems level. Otherwise, it would just be a dialogue between friends with no real outcome out of that.
If what we're talking about here is nations coming together to create regulatory standards across boundaries and so make it easier for vendors, isn't this something that's already happening? I would imagine, for example, that in the EU, the rules are the same in industrial across European nations, no?
The short answer is I don't know for sure, but I kind of thought that the first NIST directive that came out several years ago was a directive not to European critical infrastructures. It was a directive to the European nation states, the member states, saying you need to identify your critical infrastructure according to your rules. You need to put rules in place to secure your critical infrastructure. Whatever you decide your critical infrastructure is. And so each of the nations produced their own rules. And so there wasn't a high degree of uniformity across Europe, other than the rules kind of vaguely addressed the same topics. But I understand that's changing with NIST 2, and that's actually coming a little bit later in the interview. So let's wait for Pedro to weigh in on what's happening with the new NIST 2 directive. Okay, so we've been talking a lot about 62443 here. There's other standards in the world, though. There's NERC-CIP in North America. There's NIST 882. There's the NIST D regulation in Europe. What's the rest of this stuff saying about supply chain and supply chain security?
Yes, and there are many other standards that have recently published a lot of new versions or annexes or documentation, guidelines, etc., around the supply chain security in the last year or year and a half. Some of them are even quite more modern than the 62443. So, we have the good old ISO 27000, which 27001. It has the Annex 14, if I'm not mistaken, with systems acquisition and the value chain. Annex 15 with the mesh of business relationships. There's even one, the 27036, which is only for supplier relationships. But other than the ISO, NERC-CIP just published, almost 2 years ago, published the NERC-CIP 13, which is exclusively dedicated to supply chain risk management. I think, a very good move, and it came from the Biden's executive order to really put a focus in supply chain security for critical infrastructures. Now, again, that NERC 13 is very focused on the value chain of the IACs. You have to read it in combination with NERC 10, for example, about the software integrity, or NERC 5 about vendor remote access, to really build your supply chain program from the holistic perspective. Also, as you mentioned, in Europe, we have the NIS Directive version 2 that again puts a lot of focus on supply chain risk management. And I think one of the good things about the NIS Directive version 2 is that it says what I was talking about before. Let's not do this alone. Let's not do this country by country. Let's do it as Europe, because we all suffer from the same problems, and we all buy from the same vendors. So it's a Europe-wide coordination, split by sectors, and there's sector-specific profiling for supply chain security. So really taking the problem up to the EU level and not country by country. So definitely no lack of standardization, guidelines, lessons learned, piloting, documentation freely available for everyone to use. So that's basically where we stand now regarding standards.
And the discussion so far has focused on, you haven't used the word, but let me use the word, quality. Making sure that we have good people working for us and that they do good things with the source code and that we don't leak vulnerabilities in there. Not sort of basic trustworthiness. I mean, a lot of jurisdictions around the world are starting to ban suppliers as untrustworthy. There's sort of the big name, the United States banned a couple of Chinese suppliers that made it in the news, but there's thousands of lesser organizations that are banned because they are fronts for terrorism, because these organizations are fundamentally not just not trustworthy, but actually adversarial. Keeping track of all this as a vendor in the space, I know is a challenge. Are there tools or recommendations that you might have on the side of sort of managing, how trustworthy, how allowed, whether you're even allowed to do business with certain suppliers?
Yes, and you're definitely spot on with the latest efforts from MITRE, for example. So MITRE has been doing a great job trying to profile threats, right? And so far it's been technical threats, right? But the latest developments and publications by MITRE is what they call the system of trust, SOT. What that does is really, it's a kind of a framework or a tool or a standard language to profile your suppliers in many other aspects beyond the technical ones and their products and software and hardware. As you said, it's about their culture. It's about their intentions. It's about whether they can be manipulated by governance or not, or if they do business in an ethical way. It's even going into their financial stability, or if they can go bankrupt in a short time. So it's seeing the providers from multiple angles beyond the pure products they manufacture. And that, of course, has the goal of building trust to their customers. Now, other than that, and this is a great effort and standardization language by MITRE, we do have other tools. or methodologies that are being very widely discussed, and there are already some products and some companies dedicated to them, that also build trust, because they build transparency in the development, and they build and they open the dialogue between customers and suppliers, and they standardize this dialogue, so we can use tools, we can use machine readable templates, etc., and it's not a manual and subjective assessment with questionnaires, for example, anymore. So SBOMs, for example, the software bill of materials that more and more vendors are publishing, is nothing but a database of all their software components, software libraries, developing environments, etc., that they use in their products. And then the next step is what it's called the VEX, the vulnerability exploitation exchange, which is nothing but grabbing the software bill of materials and saying, look, out of these 200 potential vulnerabilities, actually only 10 are exploitable, because there only 10 are accessible, only 10 are used, etc. And then you even have standard languages that very recently came out by the German government to standardize the security advisories. So, all the vendors, they publish their vulnerabilities and their security problems, let's say, in certain security advisories or bulletins. Each company has its own format, etc. So now we have what the German government calls the Common Security Advisory Framework, which is a standard language to publish and to communicate these advisories. So all these tools, they create transparency, they create automation, they make the relationships between customers and suppliers closer and closer, and therefore they bring trust to the table, which in the end is what we're all aiming for.
Well, Pedro, this has been great. Thank you for joining us. Before we let you go, do you want to sum up for us? What should our listeners take away from this episode?
Yes, well, supply chain security is a big elephant, like we were saying in the beginning, right? And if you don't have very clear actions, you can very easily get lost in so much out there to read, to comply, and people related, process related, technology related practices. So I would say that depending on where you are in your maturity, in your security maturity, you would have different call to actions. If you're, let's say, in the lower part of the security maturity, I would start by doing a simple but effective due diligence of your vendors, assess them from the various aspects, including cybersecurity. Make that an exclusion in your contracts, and make it very clear on your contracts that they have to comply with one of their standards, whether 62443 or any the other ones. If they don't, they risk not working with you. After that, once you sign the contract, I would just monitor that very closely in terms of compliance and actual practice that they have in your operations. Now, if your security maturity is high, then start looking for SBOM vendors and VEX vendors. Start making use of the advisory framework from the German government, or explore the MITRE system of trust in your benefit. It's ready-made, is for you to use, is free to use. It just needs manpower from your side to put that into practice. So stay tuned. The whole community is working on this. A lot more to come in the near future. And thank you, Andrew, for the opportunity.
To wrap up here, supply chain didn't really become a super hot issue until, 2.5 years ago with SolarWinds. So I can understand that the problems that we're facing here, maybe the solutions haven't quite arrived yet, but they're coming.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are eagerly looking for these solutions because supply chain as an issue is coming for most vendors. I mean, any vendor who sells to businesses is going to be asked by at least one or more of their customers to do this, supply chain risk assessment stuff and to, put measures in place to protect themselves. And, any vendor who buys stuff from other vendors, and everyone does, has to push those requirements down onto their vendors and, fight the fight to persuade their vendors to do this. It's a lot of work. And, to Pedro's last point, even if, you are sort of the top of the B2B supply chain, namely, you're a business that sells to consumers, not to other businesses, and so you don't have regulations for supply chain coming down on you. If you pride yourself on a security maturity model capability level 4, well, that demands that you have a supply chain security problem. It's coming to all of us. So it's a lot of us are looking forward to some of these startups in the space producing tools, producing automation to help us out with this stuff.
Well, thanks to Pedro Fernandes for speaking with you about this, Andrew. And Andrew, thank you for speaking with me.
It's always a pleasure, Nate. Thank you.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thanks to everybody out there listening.